Hello, this is Phelim O'Neill from the Irish Farmers Journal reporting from Brussels. I'm this evening joined by Sean Kelly, MEP. Thank you, Sean, for joining us to discuss the issue of emissions and the trading systems that surround those and recent discussion that was had in the European Parliament. Sean, you're a member of the Industry Committee in Parliament. Tell me what the emission trading systems are and why they matter to Irish and indeed to EU agriculture.
Well, first of all, the emission trading scheme is part of the efforts at European Union level to reduce emissions in line with our goals, our own targets within the European Union, and now of course COP21, which is a global agreement to reduce emissions worldwide. And it's part of the process to try and get those who are big polluters to pay for polluting, and they can trade in the emissions trading scheme basically to pay for the polluting they're doing and hopefully in due course to reduce.
And would this apply to Irish factories, to any Irish factories that are involved in the production and processing of agricultural produce?
Yes, it would. It applies to especially the big factories. They would have to pay for one tonne of emissions, one trading scheme or allowance. And this would apply to obviously Irish factories as well, especially agriculture. The agribusiness is very big in Ireland. They can only do so much in terms of reducing their emissions. They have to be properly assessed. And I worked very hard over the last 12 months to bring in some amendments to the ETS so that it would accurately reflect what they were doing and wouldn't lead to a situation known as carbon leakage, where they would have to give up basically producing or reduce their production, and then it would be going to other countries which would be worse than the European Union in terms of polluting.
Do Irish and indeed European factories have to pay for the carbon that they produce?
Yes, if the ETS is about paying for the polluting you do, and that will apply to all sectors that are within the ETS
and is
scheme.
Is it all factories of all sizes, or is there a cut-off point in terms of the size of factory that has to pay?
It's usually the big factories because they're the ones who are polluting most. But where the dairy industry is concerned, especially in Ireland, we had to work very hard to ensure that it would be assessed at sub-sector level, because the Commission proposed to be done at general level, which would be decimating for the industry itself. But by having it at sub-sector level, which is known as PRODCOM, as opposed to NAS 4, complicated terms, it means, for instance, likes of whey and skim, etc., can be assessed at that level and then allowances given accordingly.
So is it a kind of a pay-as-you-go system then? Does every factory that's eligible basically buy its carbon quota, if you like, or do they have a certain amount of an allowance to start off with?
Yes, there's a scheme, but there's a limit to the scheme, so they buy what they can, and in that way then they can continue to produce. If they cannot buy, obviously then they're in a major difficulty, and that is why, for instance, that we work so hard to ensure that the qualitative assessment that is known will be reduced from 0.16 to 0.12, because to bring more of the subsectors into the assessment, and that makes it easier for the industry to be fairly assessed, and of course in the wider term to ensure that any reductions are made in a cost-effective manner. I think that's a very important way, because sometimes here in the European Parliament they come up with proposals which sound great, but the effect of it would be that it would be so costly on the industry that the industry would not be able to produce, because they wouldn't be able to hand it back to the consumer, and therefore they would be probably put out of business in due course.
Is there anything factories can do then to minimise their carbon, or can they earn a free quota or a free allocation of carbon? Is there anything that...
Well, depending on the industry, some can get free allocations. They have to make the application and that will be given.
And why would you get a free allocation? What's the idea? Why would the EU Commission or the EU give out free allocation to some factories?
Well, in the sense that if they couldn't hand the price back to the consumer, we'll say electricity producing industries can hand the price of whatever it costs back to the consumer. But if you're trading on the world market, the market goes up and down, you're not in a position to do that. And then, of course, if there's a huge price to be paid, you can't recover your costs. then of course the industry suffers.
So in other words then, if a factory located in the European Union was paying a carbon levy or a carbon charge that a factory outside the European Union wasn't, if it was trading in the same world market, they would be at a disadvantage, and there would be a risk then of that factory leaving the European Union. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, and it has actually happened in some industries already. The steel industry is one, where it was too costly within the European Union to pay, and then they upped and left and established in other countries outside the European Union. And that had two effects. Number one, it meant that there was a loss of jobs in the European Union, a loss to the economy, but unfortunately, instead of reducing emissions, it increased emissions because they didn't have the same environmental standards outside the European Union.
So it was a case of moving the problem on as opposed to solving the problem.
Moving the problem on and making the problem worse.
Right. So just coming back around then to how this might have an interest or an impact on Irish farmers, and what your particular interest in it is every sector looked at in its own, in a broad sweeping way? Like, for example, the entire dairy sector is taken together, the entire steel sector is taken together, or is there a breakdown within the element parts of each sector?
Yeah, because of the amendments we put in, especially in the dairy sector, it can be assessed at subsector level, and that is very important, because if we didn't allow that, then what would happen is that they have no choice only to reduce production to meet the demands upon them.
Across the entire sector, you wouldn't qualify, whereas if you look at some individual component parts within that sector, then it would be eligible for the allowances.
That's the way to broke, yes, and that was a very important matter for the dairy industry in Ireland.
So you've got Parliament on board for that now. What's the next step from here? Is that the problem solved, or is there more steps to be taken before we have before your solution is finally policy?
Thankfully, we got Parliament on board, and we got it voted on in Parliament with majority 2 weeks ago in Strasbourg. It now goes to what they call trilogue, which is a discussion essentially between the Council and the Parliament and the Commission, but I think the Council will be on board as well. So the fact we got it through Parliament was the key one. I think it's going to become a reality now, and so that the dairy industry can breathe a sigh of relief at home. There is no way they will go back and change what we decided in Parliament, because it took so long, there were so many discussions on it, and I think that the Council will see the sense of what we've done, and normally it's easy enough to trilogue after that.
So in other words, you are over the hill, you're over the hard part of the journey is travelled, and the winning post is in sight.
I think that's where we would look at it. It would be a major change in direction if they were to go back now to what the Commission proposed initially, after Parliament debating it for over 2 years and eventually getting a practical approach to it, and the Parliament itself agreed by a very strong majority. I think it will become reality now.
Sean Kelly, MEP, thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome for them. Thank you.